Hi, it's Dr. Amy Salerno, also known as Dr. Latina or Dra Latina, coming to you on the 5th of January after the publication of the Affidavit of Bryan Christopher Kohberger out of Idaho. Stay tuned as I discuss some of the specifics and some of my impressions. First of all, I wanted to thank everybody for participating in my very first live episode the other night, and I thank the more than 500 people that participated in the chat, as well as the very unexpected super chats and super stickers that I received. I wanted to extend my gratitude to both Tyler Feller at Tyler Feller for being a guest panelist, also to Jules from Allegedly Innocent for her participation in the live as a guest panelist. This was a really exciting step for me to be able to affiliate with other creators as well as to affiliate with followers and subs on a live platform. And as I go along more, I hope to get a little bit more sophisticated and a little bit more elegant in how I do some of my graphics during the lives as well as during these posts. Today I'm going to be discussing briefly just a very touchstone review of some of the high points that I took from the affidavit, the publication of the affidavit of Bryan Christopher Kohberger out in Idaho. And I think there are three pieces that I wanted to mention, and I'm going to try to upload for you all in the link below some bits of graphic teachable sort of papers that I can utilize to help you to understand a little bit more about what I'm talking about. First of all, I wanted to mention that what struck me the most with respect to Bryan proper in the affidavit is the fact that there was compelling physical in vivo on the site of 1122 DNA, as well as physical evidence like the sheath from his knife that he left. There was also forensic digital information that was incredibly compelling and which revealed that this was not a spur of the moment sort of what we call an amok, A-M-O-K, an amok reaction, which is an antiquated medical psychiatric term for when somebody runs amok, you've heard that expression, or when they sort of have a sudden psychotic break and they do something that is unplanned and perhaps even criminally insane. No. This affidavit reveals that Mr. Kohberger, with malice aforethought, with great and intentional planning, staged this crime. In other words, he planned this crime. There's evidence digitally that he actually went to Moscow, Idaho, on multiple occasions by that 1122 neighborhood, that indeed he was present digitally and on camera, his Elantra, at the precise time that one of the surviving roommates witnessed him, albeit masked and in dark attire. She witnessed him in that home. So there is so much damning evidence at this point that I believe it's going to be quite difficult to raise some sort of a strong defense. Now, from a psychiatric point of view, and remember, I'm not a forensic psychiatrist, okay? I'm a practicing physician. I practice psychiatry, but not in forensic. I'm going to give you a couple of my impressions. First of all, it's very important to remember the difference between mental illness, whether it's depression, bipolar, mania, schizophrenic, schizoaffective, OCD, mental illness, personality disorder, like sociopathy, antisocial personality disorder, obsessive compulsive personality disorder, narcissism, for instance. There's a difference between those medical findings and diagnoses, of which we don't know yet about Mr. Kohberger, and the legal definition and the legal defense of insanity. So being, quote, criminally insane and mounting that as your defense, which they cannot do, by the way. Idaho doesn't have that. But let's say we're a state that allowed for the legal defense of not responsible because of criminal insanity. That is a legal term, insanity. It is not medical. And right now what needs to happen is for Mr. Kohberger to have a comprehensive forensic, psychiatric, psychological evaluation. In addition, as I like to term, a social autopsy as well needs to be done. Let's look at his past and remember that past behaviors are predictive of future behaviors. Not 100%, but they give a lot of information, okay? What I noticed in court, very interestingly, was some of his body language. He was alert, oriented. He expressed understanding of the questions that the judge was asking. He had no interest in asking questions beyond what she presented in the affidavit. If you go back to the video of him in court, what I noticed were two things. One is that he has, while very stoic and rather flat affect, okay, looking at the judge with very little emotion, notice his temporomandibular or TMJ joint and the muscles, the buccal muscles on the right side. As she was reading the affidavit, there was a lot of bruxism or grinding of his teeth and biting down on his teeth. And you can see that in the motion of the muscle of his right side. I don't know what the left side was doing, but that revealed a measure of anxiety, a measure of angst, and obvious understanding by him of the gravity of the situation. The other thing that I noticed he did on a couple of occasions is what we call the, quote, Globus response or reflex, G-L-O-B as in boy, U-S, Globus. And that's when you can see a person swallow, and you'll see it's not just a regular swallow, but it's an intense swallow. And that swallow is mediated by the limbic system in your brain, the center for emotion, so that no matter how hard most human beings try to hide their emotions, when the limbic system is triggered by intense fear or emotion or anxiety, there is a, quote, Globus response. And you see it in a very heavy swallowing response. And you see it in the neck going up and down. So I would encourage you guys to go back. If I had the sophistication, I would right now be inserting an example of a portion of that live video to show you, and I don't know how to do that yet, but I wanted to direct you to look at those. So from a very clinical, but without making firm diagnoses, obviously, I'm going to tell you that the affidavit to me as a physician psychiatrist in clinical practice, the affidavit revealed that there was high abilities with his executive functioning, which is the frontal lobe, frontal cortex area for planning, right, and following through, that this guy followed through, planned, he executed literally and figuratively his plan, and that this was done more than a week, 2 weeks prior to the crime. And that shows that a person is able to know right from wrong. For instance, the fact that in certain points he turned off his or put on airplane mode his telephone so that he couldn't be tracked. All of those examples that you'll see in the affidavit show that he understood that there was something he was doing that was wrong, and he didn't want to be tracked for that offense. So again, that shows an ability to be compos mentis, or that your mind is able to understand and to know right from wrong. These are very compelling points in this affidavit. Now, I wanted to briefly speak to the fact that we need to remember that there are 4 victims that are deceased. This is, God willing, not going to become the Bryan Kohberger show, okay? I don't want it to become a circus where everything is revolved around his every movement, his defense, his this, his that. I want to try to remember with every post that I do that there are 4 people, human beings, that are deceased. One of the most powerful aspects of today's reading of the affidavit for me was when the judge read the charges and read the name of each victim. After the naming of each victim, there was a pause, and there was the statement, a human being. So she said he is charged with first-degree murder in the death of Kaylee Gonsalves, a human being, of Ethan Chapin, a human being, of Madison Mogan, a human being, and of Zana Rosana Kernodle, a human being. That was so powerful for me because it causes us great pause. Let us not forget that each of these victims was a unique creature, human being, whose life was snuffed out criminally. In another post, I'm going to be going over the 5 stages of grief, and I'll have a nice handout that you all can print if you want. I'm going to touch on the affidavit and the surviving roommate, the one that they did highlight. There were 2 surviving roommates. But the one, I believe it was DM, I'm not going to say the name, DM, and indeed, she was living on that 2nd floor of the apartment, not in the basement. She was indeed on the 2nd floor, like Lana Oriani stated in her assessment of the living situation and of the floor plan a couple of weeks ago in Truth and Transparency. She was able to figure out that the one surviving roommate was indeed on the second floor. And in the affidavit, it talks specifically about DM on the second floor and actually coming face to face with the suspect, Bryan Kohberger. What he looked like, how she responded, how he reacted, and how he exited quickly from the sliding glass door on that second floor. And I, as a clinician, wanted to speak to her having frozen in her footsteps and then having retreated and locked the door. And many people on social media and in the mainstream media have been saying, why didn't she call 911 right away? Why didn't she call 911 right away? And I wanted to review with you all, it used to be 3 trauma responses: flight, fright, and freeze, okay? And in recent years, we know that there are 2 or even 3 more acute and chronic trauma responses that people can have: fright, flight, freeze, flop, and fawn, fawning over somebody. Flop is when somebody literally faints and they become unconscious. Well, we know what fear or fright is. We know what flight is, which is what it sounds like the suspect, Mr. Kohberger, did, was he got out of there when he saw her, came face to face. And what DM did was she froze. Now, that is a very normal trauma response. And part of that trauma response is, when one freezes, can be to dissociate. It can be something that is so frightening, so horrible, that the person freezes physically. So the fright can, and the fear and the trauma acutely can be so horrific that a person initially freezes and then they retreat, like DM did, into her bedroom. She could have, at that point, dissociated out of fear and kind of removed herself psychiatrically from the situation. It was so horrible. It could also be that in those hours after having been shaken to her boots, that her freeze response prevented her from taking action. Clearly, she wasn't with her roommate or housemate down in the basement. She was all by herself. And it may have been as a normal trauma response that she stayed quiet and stayed put until the sun came up and until she felt safe enough to make calls, to move out of her room, etc. So I really was struck by that freeze response, and I really hope that it allows people that have been speculating that somehow she was complicit and or that there's something wrong with the person, that they didn't call 911 right away. I think, from what I could glean from the affidavit, that this was her trauma response. And we're going to look more down the road on future episodes about the trauma responses that people can have when they have, from an acute trauma, a chronic trauma response or PTSD, and how can people heal from such a horrible situation. And I will hopefully going forward revisit some of this and how do we understand trauma and how do we heal from it? How is DM in particular going to heal from this horrific trauma that she's experienced? there's so much more to say, but I think the take-home message here for me tonight to you is that the affidavit reveals malice aforethought by the suspect. It reveals profound trauma by the surviving victim. And we hope that we can learn a lot more about this case going forward. And on that note, my friends, I'm going to say go forward with courage. Adelante con valentía. Avanti con coraggio.